I found out my wife was cheating on me. But not the way you think. I didn't catch her in a text. I didn't hear a rumor. I watched it happen. Live. At first, I thought it was just a mistake. Wrong place, wrong person, wrong timing. But then she smiled. The same smile she used to give me. And in that moment, I realized something that completely broke me. It wasn't just betrayal. It was the fact that she had already replaced me. And the worst part? She thought I would never find out. 3 months ago, if you asked me about my life, I would have told you that everything felt stable in a way that didn't need to be exciting or perfect, because it was real, predictable, and grounded. And for me, that was more than enough to feel like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. I had a steady job that wasn't anything impressive, but it paid the bills, gave me structure, and allowed me to build something consistent day by day without constantly worrying about what would happen next. And when you combine that kind of stability with having someone waiting for you at home, someone you trust completely, it creates this quiet sense of security that you don't question. Her name was Emily, and we met in college in the most ordinary way possible, which is probably why it felt so natural from the very beginning, because there was no pressure, no expectations, and no moment where it felt like something big was supposed to happen. We just ended up sitting next to each other in a class neither of us really cared about, and somehow that was enough to start everything. At first, our conversations were simple and almost forgettable, the kind of small talk you don't think will lead anywhere, where you complain about assignments, make sarcastic comments about the professor, and exchange notes that neither of you will probably ever look at again. But what made it different was the fact that it didn't stop there, because every time we talked, it felt a little easier to continue, a little more natural, like there was no effort required to keep it going. Over time, those small conversations turned into something that extended beyond the classroom, where we started walking out together after lectures, texting each other late at night about things that didn't really matter, and calling each other just to fill silence. And without any clear moment where everything changed, she became part of my daily routine in a way that felt completely normal. Emily had this calm and effortless confidence that didn't rely on attention, which made people naturally gravitate toward her without her ever trying too hard. And she had this way of listening that made you feel like what you were saying actually mattered, even if it was something small or insignificant. And for someone like me, who wasn't used to being the center of attention or even expressing much at all, that meant more than I probably realized at the time. I've always been more reserved, the kind of person who stays in the background, avoids unnecessary conversations, and keeps things to himself. But when I was with her, that part of me didn't feel like a limitation anymore, because she created a space where I didn't have to pretend or change anything. I could just exist as I was, and somehow that was enough for her. We started dating a few months later, and unlike most relationships I had seen before, there was no confusion, no mixed signals, and no feeling that one person cared more than the other, because everything between us felt balanced, simple, and consistent in a way that made it easy to trust. As time passed, that trust grew into something stronger, something that didn't need constant reassurance or validation, because it was built through small, repeated moments, through showing up for each other every day without fail, and through the quiet understanding that we were both moving in the same direction. 5 years later, when I asked her to marry me, it didn't feel like a risk or a big decision that required overthinking. It felt like the most natural step we could take, and I didn't need a perfect setup or a dramatic proposal to make it meaningful. So I chose the same place where we first met, because it reminded me of how everything started in the simplest way possible. I remember feeling nervous, but not because I was unsure about her or about us, but because I understood how much that moment meant. And when she looked at me, smiled, and said yes without hesitation, it only confirmed everything I already believed, that this was the person I was meant to build my life with. After we got married, nothing about our relationship suddenly changed, and in a way that made everything feel even more real, because instead of chasing something new, we settled into routines that gave our life structure and meaning, where we cooked dinner together after work, watched the same shows every week, and had small arguments that never really mattered, but somehow made everything feel normal. Our weekends were simple, Sometimes we went out. Sometimes we stayed home doing nothing at all. But even those quiet moments felt right, because being together was enough to make them meaningful, and that consistency created a sense of permanence that I never questioned. That's the thing about trust. It doesn't come from big gestures or dramatic moments. It comes from repetition, from knowing that no matter what kind of day you've had, you'll come home and that person will be there, acting the same way they always have, and giving you no reason to doubt anything. And Emily, she was that person for me, always present, always consistent, always someone I believed in completely, at least at that time, before anything started to change in ways I didn't want to notice. Looking back now, I realize that when something feels real for long enough, you stop questioning it entirely. You stop paying attention to small details, and you convince yourself that nothing could possibly go wrong, even when subtle changes begin to appear. Because the truth is, things don't fall apart all at once. They start with small shifts that are easy to ignore, like a change in tone, a slight distance, or something that feels off but not serious enough to confront. And instead of facing it, you choose to believe everything is still the same. And that's exactly what I did, because it was easier to trust what I thought was real than to question it. And by the time I finally noticed that something was wrong, it was already too late. If I'm being honest, nothing changed all at once, because if it had, I probably would have noticed it immediately and confronted it before it got worse. But that's not how things like this happen. They don't break loudly. They shift quietly, in ways that make you question yourself before you question the other person. At first, it was so small that I almost felt stupid even thinking about it, like I was overanalyzing things that didn't really matter, because on the surface, everything still looked the same. We still lived together, still talked, still followed the same routines. But something about the way she moved through those routines started to feel different, in a way I couldn't explain. Emily began coming home later than usual, and not in a way that felt dramatic or suspicious, but just enough to stand out if you paid attention. Because before that, she was always predictable, always consistent with her schedule. And suddenly, there were more late nights at work that came without much explanation, beyond a quick sentence and a tired expression. I didn't question it at first, because it made sense. People get busy, work gets stressful, and relationships go through phases where things aren't perfectly aligned. So instead of asking too many questions, I chose to trust her the same way I always had, because that's what I believed a good relationship was built on. But then it wasn't just the schedule. It was her phone. And I know how that sounds, because checking someone's behavior around their phone can feel like paranoia if you don't have a real reason. But the difference was impossible to ignore once I noticed it, because she used to leave her phone anywhere without thinking about it. On the couch, on the kitchen counter, sometimes even unlocked, like it didn't matter at all. And then, without any clear moment where it started, that changed. Her phone was always with her. Not just nearby, but in her hand, in her pocket, or placed face down like it was something she didn't want to risk exposing. And even when she stepped out of the room for a second, she would take it with her, which was something she had never done before. I remember one night trying to make a joke about it, just to see her reaction without making it serious. And I said something like, "What? Are you hiding something from me now?" In a light tone that wasn't meant to accuse her of anything. She laughed, but it didn't feel like a normal laugh. It was too quick, too automatic, like it was more of a reaction than something genuine. And she immediately brushed it off by saying I was being paranoid, that work had been stressful and she just didn't want to deal with anything extra. And even though the explanation made sense on the surface, something about it didn't sit right with me. Still, I let it go. Because when you trust someone for that long, you don't jump to conclusions. You don't assume the worst. You give them the benefit of the doubt, even when something feels slightly off. And I kept telling myself that I was just overthinking things, that I was creating a problem that didn't actually exist. But then the distance started. Not in a way that you could point at and say, this is where everything changed, but in small, almost invisible ways that built up over time, where conversations became shorter, where she seemed less present even when she was right next to me, where moments that used to feel natural started to feel forced. We still talked, but it felt different, like she was there physically, but not mentally, like her attention was somewhere else, even when she was looking straight at me. I tried to ignore it at first, but it's hard to ignore something you feel every single day, especially when you don't understand why it's happening. And eventually, I started trying to fix it in the only ways I knew how. I suggested we go out more, planned small things for us to do together, tried to bring back the kind of moments we used to have without even thinking about them. But every time I made an effort, there was always some kind of excuse. She was tired. Work was overwhelming. Maybe another time. And each time she said that, it sounded reasonable on its own. But when you hear it over and over again, it starts to feel less like a coincidence and more like a pattern you can't ignore anymore. That's when the feeling really started. That quiet, uncomfortable thought in the back of your mind that you don't want to fully acknowledge. Because the moment you do, everything changes. Something isn't right. And no matter how much I tried to explain it away, no matter how many logical reasons I gave myself, that feeling didn't go away. It stayed there, growing slowly, waiting for something to confirm it. And eventually, that confirmation came. At some point, it stopped feeling like a phase that would pass on its own and started feeling like something permanent, something that had quietly settled into our relationship without asking for permission. And no matter how much I tried to convince myself that I was overthinking it, the difference in the way she acted became impossible to ignore. It wasn't one big change that you could point at and say, this is the problem. It was a collection of small things that, when put together, created a completely different version of the person I thought I knew. And the hardest part about it was that if you looked at any single moment on its own, it didn't seem serious enough to question. But when you lived through it every day, it added up. Conversations that used to flow naturally started to feel like something we were both forcing just to avoid silence. And even when we did talk, there was a disconnect I couldn't explain. Like her responses were automatic. Like she was saying the right things without actually being there in the moment. There were times when I would tell her something simple about my day, and she would nod or respond. But a few minutes later, it felt like she hadn't really heard me at all. Like her attention had been somewhere else the entire time. And that kind of thing might seem small. But when it happens over and over again, it starts to feel like you're slowly disappearing from someone's life while still standing right in front of them. The physical distance wasn't obvious either, which somehow made it worse, because it wasn't like she completely pulled away or avoided me entirely. She was still there, still sitting next to me, still sharing the same space. But the connection that used to exist between us felt weaker, like something that was fading instead of breaking. I started noticing how often she seemed distracted, how her phone would light up, and she would glance at it just long enough to read something before turning it face down again. And every time that happened, there was this brief moment where her expression changed. Subtle, but real. Like something about that message mattered more than whatever was happening between us. I told myself it didn't mean anything, that I was reading too much into it. But at the same time, I couldn't ignore the way it made me feel. There's a specific kind of feeling you get when something is wrong, but you don't have proof, where you're stuck between trusting the person you love and trusting your own instincts. And no matter which one you choose, it feels like you're making the wrong decision. So instead of confronting it directly, I tried to fix what I thought was just a temporary distance. I put in more effort. I tried to be more present, more attentive, more understanding, thinking that maybe she was just going through something she didn't know how to talk about yet. And if I gave her enough space while still showing up for her, things would go back to the way they used to be. But they didn't. If anything, the more I tried, the more it felt like I was the only one trying at all. Every plan I suggested was met with hesitation. Every attempt to reconnect felt one-sided. And slowly, without any clear moment where it happened, I started to feel like I was no longer a priority in her life. Not because she said it, but because she showed it. In the way she avoided conversations that used to come easily. In the way she chose distance over closeness. In the way she seemed more engaged with whatever was happening on her phone than with the person sitting next to her. And that's when the thought finally became impossible to ignore. It wasn't just stress. It wasn't just a phase. It was something else. Something I didn't want to fully admit yet. But something I could already feel was going to change everything. And the worst part was, I still didn't know how bad it really was. By the time that night came, I was already living with a feeling I couldn't fully explain. Something that sat in the back of my mind, no matter how much I tried to ignore it. And even though I still didn't have any real proof that something was wrong, I could feel that whatever was happening between us had reached a point where it wasn't going to fix itself. That evening started like any other. Nothing dramatic, nothing out of place, just another normal day that blended into all the others. And if someone had looked at us from the outside, they probably wouldn't have noticed anything unusual at all. Emily told me she was going out with coworkers. It wasn't the first time. She had mentioned these outings before. Casual drinks after work. Something to unwind. Something that made sense, considering how often she talked about being stressed lately. And under normal circumstances, I wouldn't have thought twice about it. But something about the way she said it felt different. It wasn't what she said. It was how she said it. There was a slight hesitation, almost unnoticeable, but enough to make me pause for a second longer than I usually would. And even though I didn't say anything in that moment, that feeling I had been trying to ignore came back stronger. Still, I let it go. I told her to have fun, tried to act normal, tried to convince myself that I was just overthinking again, because at that point, I had already questioned things so many times in my own head that I didn't want to turn it into something real without a reason. She left, and the apartment felt quieter than usual. Not just physically quiet, but empty in a way I hadn't really noticed before. Like her absence carried more weight than it used to, and instead of distracting myself, I found my mind going back to all the small things I had been ignoring over the past weeks. The late nights, the distance, the phone, all of it. Around midnight, I checked my phone and realized I hadn't heard from her. That wasn't completely unusual, but given everything else, it felt different this time, like something I couldn't just brush off as easily as before. So I sent a simple message. Hey, everything okay? Nothing serious, nothing accusatory, just enough to check in. Minutes passed, no reply. I told myself she was busy. Maybe the place was loud. Maybe she didn't see it. Maybe her phone was in her bag, and every explanation made sense on its own, but none of them made the feeling go away. An hour passed. Still nothing. At that point, it stopped feeling like a coincidence. I tried to distract myself, turned on the TV, scrolled through my phone, did anything to keep my mind from going back to that same thought over and over again, but it didn't work. Because deep down, I already knew something wasn't right. By 2 a.m., the silence felt heavier than anything else. Not just the fact that she hadn't replied, but the fact that I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being lied to, even though I didn't have anything concrete to prove it yet. That's when I did something I had never done before. Something I told myself I would never need to do. I checked her location, and the moment I saw it, everything changed. Because she wasn't where she said she would be. Not even close. And in that exact moment, every doubt, every small sign, every feeling I had been trying to ignore suddenly connected into something real, something undeniable, something I couldn't explain away anymore. My heart started racing. Not out of panic, but out of realization. Because whatever I was about to find, I already knew it wasn't going to be good. And instead of waiting, instead of trying to come up with another explanation, I grabbed my keys and I left. The drive there felt longer than it actually was, even though I knew the route, even though I had probably been in that area before, without thinking twice about it. But this time, every second stretched in a way that made it hard to breathe, because my mind kept racing ahead of me, trying to prepare for something I wasn't ready to face. I kept telling myself there had to be an explanation. Something simple, something logical. Maybe the location was wrong. Maybe she was with a friend. Maybe I was about to overreact and regret it the moment I got there. I repeated those thoughts over and over again, not because I fully believed them, but because they were easier to hold on to than the alternative, and the alternative was something I wasn't ready to accept yet. When I finally got there, I didn't rush out of the car right away. I just sat there for a moment, staring at the street, trying to match what I saw with what I hoped to see. And for a brief second, I thought maybe this was all in my head. But then I saw it. Her car, parked right in front of a house I had never seen before. And just like that, every doubt I had tried to hold on to started falling apart. My chest felt tight, not from panic, not exactly, but from the weight of realizing that whatever I was about to walk into was going to change everything, and there was no way to undo it once I did. I got out of the car slowly, like moving too fast would somehow make it more real, and as I walked toward the house, I could see that the lights were on inside, which made it impossible to pretend that no one was there. Each step felt heavier than the last. Not because I was unsure of what I might find, but because deep down, I already knew. There's a moment, right before something breaks, where everything becomes painfully clear, even if you haven't seen it yet, and that was exactly what this felt like. I reached the door, and for a second, I just stood there, listening, thinking, hoping in some irrational way that if I waited long enough, something would change. But nothing did. So I knocked. Once. No answer. I knocked again, louder this time, and I could feel my heartbeat in my chest, in my hands, in every part of my body, like everything inside me was telling me to stop, to turn around, to not go any further. But I didn't. A few seconds passed, and then the door opened. And there she was, Emily, standing right in front of me. For a moment, neither of us said anything. She just looked at me, not shocked, not confused, just still. And that was the moment it hit me harder than anything else could have. Because if she had been surprised, if she had panicked, if she had tried to explain immediately, maybe I could have held on to something. Maybe I could have believed there was still a version of this that wasn't exactly what it looked like. But she didn't. She just stood there, like she already knew this moment was coming. And then, without even trying to hide it, I saw him, in the background. Another guy. Standing inside that house like he belonged there. Like this wasn't new. Like this wasn't a mistake. Everything after that felt blurred. I don't remember exactly what I said. I don't remember how my voice sounded. I don't even remember what she said at first. Because in that moment, none of it really mattered. The only thing that mattered was the realization. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't bad timing. It wasn't something that just happened once. This was real, and it had been real for longer than I wanted to believe. But there is one thing she said that stayed with me. One sentence that cut through everything else. She looked at me and said, "I didn't mean for you to find out like this." And somehow, that made it worse than anything else she could have said. I wish I could say that, after that moment, everything became clear instantly. Like my mind suddenly organized itself, and I understood exactly what was going on. But the truth is, it didn't feel like clarity at all. It felt like everything inside me was breaking into pieces at the same time, while I was still standing in front of her, trying to process something my brain refused to fully accept. We didn't argue right away. There wasn't even real shouting at first, just silence that stretched in a way that felt heavier than any words could have been, because she was still standing there. He was still in the background, and I was still trying to understand how my entire life had ended up in this exact moment without me seeing it coming. And then she finally spoke. Not in a panicked way, not in denial, but in a tone that almost sounded rehearsed, like she had already thought about this conversation before it ever happened. She told me it wasn't supposed to become something serious, that it started as just talking, that it happened slowly, without intention, without planning, without any moment where she could clearly say she chose this over me, even though every word she said was still building a reality where that was exactly what happened. I remember standing there, listening, and the strangest part was how normal her voice sounded, like she was explaining something simple, something understandable, something that didn't involve completely destroying the life we had built together. She said she felt distant for a while, that things between us changed, that she didn't feel the same connection anymore, and instead of talking to me about it, instead of trying to fix it, she just let it happen. And then she met him. That part wasn't said with emotion either. It was just presented like a fact, like it was a natural next step in a story that had already been written long before I ever arrived at that door. The hardest part wasn't even what she admitted. It was realizing how long it had been going on without me knowing. Because when I asked her how long, there was a pause that said more than her answer ever could. Months. Not days. Not a mistake that spiraled out of control in a week. Months of messages, meetings, moments I was completely unaware of while I was still coming home, still trusting, still believing that whatever distance I felt was just temporary. And while she was talking, I kept thinking back to every small sign I ignored, every moment I explained away, every time I chose to believe her, instead of that quiet feeling in my gut that something wasn't right. And it was like watching my own memories rearrange themselves into something I couldn't recognize anymore. At some point, I asked her the question I didn't really want to hear the answer to, even though I already knew it. If she ever planned to tell me, if she was going to end things properly before starting something else. And she didn't answer immediately. That silence again. The same silence that kept appearing in all the worst moments of that night. And then she said something I wasn't prepared for, not because it was loud or dramatic, but because it was honest in a way that didn't soften anything. She said she didn't know how to leave me, that it felt easier to live two lives than to end one of them. And in that moment, something inside me stopped trying to understand her. Not because I suddenly hated her, not because I stopped caring instantly, but because I realized I had been trying to make sense of something that was never built on honesty in the first place. Everything I thought we were, everything I believed we had. It wasn't something that broke in that moment. It had already been breaking for a long time. I was just the last one to see it. And once that realization fully settled in, there was nothing left to argue about, nothing left to fix, nothing left to save, because you can't repair something that was already gone before you even knew it was dying. And that's when I turned around. Not because I understood everything, but because I finally understood enough. I don't remember the drive back in a clean, linear way, like a normal memory you can replay from beginning to end. Instead, it's just fragments, scattered pieces of the road, streetlights passing by in a blur, my hands gripping the steering wheel without really feeling them, and this strange silence in my head that felt louder than anything I had ever experienced before. Because even though the world outside was still moving normally, mine had completely stopped. When I got back to the apartment, nothing had changed physically. Everything was exactly the same as it had been before I left. The same walls, the same furniture, the same quiet atmosphere that used to feel comfortable, but now it felt unfamiliar. Like I was standing inside someone else's life, and I wasn't sure how I had ended up there. I stood in the doorway for a long time without moving, just looking around, trying to connect the space I was in with the life I thought I had. But it didn't match anymore, because every object, every corner, every small detail now carried a different meaning, and none of it felt safe or normal in the way it used to. I didn't cry right away. I didn't react the way people expect you to react in moments like that. It was more like a shutdown. Like my mind had reached a point where it couldn't process anything further, so it just went quiet. Not peaceful quiet, but the kind of silence that happens when something inside you stops trying to make sense of what it can't understand. At some point, I sat down, not even sure why, and just stayed there, without turning on the lights, without checking my phone, without doing anything at all, because everything I could think of felt useless. Like every possible action I could take belonged to a version of me that didn't exist anymore. And the worst part wasn't even the confrontation itself anymore. It was the replay. Because once your mind sees something like that, it doesn't let go of it easily. It keeps bringing it back, over and over again. Every detail, every word, every pause, every expression, and suddenly you start noticing things you ignored for months. Not because they were hidden, but because you weren't ready to see them. Her phone, the late nights, the distance, the way conversations slowly disappeared without me realizing it. All of it started connecting in a way that felt unbearable, like my brain was rebuilding the entire story from the beginning, but this time without the illusion that everything was fine. And the hardest realization wasn't even that she cheated. It was that I had been living in a version of reality where I believed I would notice if something was wrong, that I would feel it early enough to stop it. But the truth is, I didn't notice anything until it was already too late to change anything. That night, I didn't sleep. I just stayed there, going through everything in my head, trying to find a moment where I could say, this is where it started. But the more I thought about it, the more I understood that there wasn't one single moment. It was a slow accumulation of small decisions, small silences, small changes that I accepted without question because I trusted her completely. And because of that trust, I never thought to look deeper until I was forced to. By morning, the apartment felt even emptier. Not because anything new had happened, but because reality had fully settled in, and there was no longer any confusion left to hold on to. So I started packing. Not in a dramatic way, not with anger or frustration, but slowly, methodically, like I was closing a chapter I didn't fully understand, but knew I couldn't stay inside anymore. Clothes, essentials, a few personal things, nothing more than what I needed to leave, because at that point staying felt heavier than leaving, and every item I picked up felt like I was disconnecting myself from a life that no longer existed in the way I thought it did. When I finally closed the door behind me, I didn't feel relief, and I didn't feel revenge, or closure, or anything cinematic like that. I just felt quiet. Not peaceful quiet, just absence. And as I walked away, I kept thinking about something she said that night, that she didn't know how to leave me. And maybe that was the part that stayed with me the most. Not because it explained anything, but because it revealed everything. Because it meant this wasn't a sudden decision. It wasn't a mistake that spiraled overnight. It was a slow avoidance of truth, a gradual choice to live in a situation that required lying instead of facing discomfort. And I just happened to be the person on the receiving end of it. And what hurt the most wasn't even that she chose someone else. It was that I trusted a version of reality that she had already stopped believing in long before I ever noticed. Looking back now, I realized something important, something I didn't understand at the time, which is that betrayal doesn't always start with a single action. It often starts with silence, with distance, with the small moments you choose not to question because everything else still looks fine. And by the time I understood that, fully, I was already standing in the aftermath of something I never saw coming, trying to understand how something that felt so real could disappear without warning.